All right, so typically when somebody comes for help with their negative body image, their eating disorder, their disordered eating, they have so much despair and hopelessness and self-loathing that there's almost like no energy in the room for healing. And so the question for us therapists is, all right, where are you going to get that energy? How do we bring that into the room? How do we find that? And so to explore that, I'm going to begin by speaking in what I consider the language of eating disorders. It may seem a little odd to you, but I'll kind of explain it later. Once upon a time, there was this man who had black and white cattle, and he loved his cattle so much that he treated them like his own children. And every morning he would go out to milk his black and white cattle, and they would give him white frothy milk. So one morning he goes out to milk the black and white cattle, and there's no milk. And he said, well, that's strange. The next morning he goes out to milk the black and white cattle, again no milk. So he moves the cattle to a place where the grass is greener, thinking this will solve the problem. Third morning he goes out to milk his black and white cattle, still no milk. So he says to himself, something is really wrong here. I'm going to stay up all night until I can see what it is. And that's what he did. And in the wee hours of the morning, he saw the most amazing sight. The heavens opened, and down from the heavens came this huge rope. And climbing down the rope were the most amazing women he had ever seen. And they were carrying calabashes. And they went over to the black and white cattle, and they milked the white frothy milk. Well, the man didn't care about the milk. These women were the most amazing women he had ever seen. So he ran towards them and he grabbed one. She shrieked, calabashes, milk went flying everywhere as the rest of the women scurried up the rope into the heavens. And he held on tight to her, and she fought. And the more she fought, the tighter he held, until he said, woman, I want to marry you. She stopped fighting. She said, well, all right, I'll agree to marry you. Under one condition. Well, what's that? He said. Well, I have this basket that is so exquisitely woven that the lid fits perfectly on the bottom. I'll agree to marry you if you agree not to open the basket until I say so. Is that it? He said. So they were married, and she was a very good wife, and she loved his black and white cattle and treated them as though they were her own children. So one morning, she was out milking the black and white cattle, and he was sitting around the house. And his eyes went up to the top shelf where the basket was. And he said to himself, we've been married a long time. All of what is mine is hers. Surely what is hers is mine. It's not going to do any harm to take a peek in that basket. So he got up, took the basket down from the shelf, and he put it on his lap. And very carefully, he lifted the lid that fit perfectly on the bottom, and he peeked inside. He said, I can't believe she's made such a big deal out of this. There's nothing here. He put the lid back on the bottom, put the basket back up on the shelf. So when his wife came home, she said, so, husband, what have you been doing? And he said, I looked in the basket. She said, you looked in the basket? Yeah, I can't believe you made such a big deal out of this. So you looked in the basket, and what did you see? Nothing. There was nothing there. You looked in the basket, and you saw nothing. If only you would have waited, I would have shown you how to see what was in the basket. Now I must take my basket and leave. She left him. And the old Kikuyu storyteller says, mankind still thinks those things of the spirit which cannot be seen are nothing. Now, I tell you this story as a cautionary tale, because as we therapists, we don't want to be like the man in the story. Because with eating disorders, there are forces, there are invisible forces that are driving the disordered eating, driving the negative body image thoughts. And we need to learn how to tune into those and perceive them. So Michael Meade, who's a cosmologist and a storyteller, he says this: the world has become a literalized place. It has become a place of fact and what they call the world of measurement, where things are measured as if to describe what they really are. It's not that the facts don't matter. It's that they can't tell the whole story. So when you get to the whole story about eating disorders, you discover a paradox. Eating disorders are about food and eating, and they're not about food and eating. Negative body image is about the body and is not about the body. And so what happens is we have to find some way to straddle and be with this paradox, to really contain it. If we simply focus on what someone is doing with eating and food, and not what's going on in the rest of their lives, we're missing a big chunk. And if we focus just on what's going on in the rest of their lives and not what's going on with them and food, we're missing another chunk, because the answers lie in the connection between the two. And this is something I'm always emphasizing to my staff at Pono, is that's where the work lies, is in between the two. So you can't get caught up in the details of the story in either direction. You really need to find that invisible gap. So the problem is, though, that this connection is hidden, right? So how do you find it? And one of the ways I've discovered to do this is through the use of metaphor. And we therapists, we have to help clients find that connection for them, right? Theories are all well and good, and we know things like deprivation of food can lead to binge eating, and we can theorize that people eat for all sorts of emotional reasons or restrict for emotional reasons. But if we simply present these concepts to them, they're not going to find those hidden connections, right, that are often buried very deep within their own psyches. And here's the thing, you want them to find that connection because that way they can disconnect and resolve the eating disorder. And yes, eating disorders can be 100%. Someone can recovered, period. And I know, because over 35 years I've seen thousands, and I know of thousands who have totally, completely recovered, done deal. But our job then is, okay, how do we get them to that place? This is the storytelling and the metaphor I found is a really useful way to get there. And I stumbled across this in the early 1980s when I was supervising a psychology student at UH who was studying the incidence of eating disorders in Hawaii. And she was doing her doctoral dissertation, and we would meet every week to talk about this, and we were joined by a third woman who was a social worker who had had her own recovery experience, and talking about what we were seeing in the community. And every time we talked about it, we went, oh my gosh, there's a serious problem here. There should be a center for this. Right? After about the fifth time we laughed, we looked at each other and we went, all right. And so that's how the Anorexia and Bulimia Center of Hawaii was born. And it was sort of those, you build it, they come, and they came. Girls and women, all ages, all shapes, all sizes, all ethnicities, all sorts of gender identification. No males were showing up back in those days. And so I began to get very curious. How am I going to solve this mystery? What's going on here? And so, because I grew up in a multi-ethnic culture on the island of Guam, where storytelling was a big part of that tradition, and because I, as a psychologist, right, I'm a trained story listener, I decided to just listen as carefully as I could to their stories to see if I could find out what is going on. Now, back then, anorexia nervosa had just become a household word because of Karen Carpenter. She died from that. Bulimia had just been diagnosed, and binge eating disorder wasn't even on the map. So I found myself asking these three questions. Why was it females that are showing up? Why was it these particular girls and women who were struggling? And why was the struggle around food and eating and body image? And so as I began to listen to their stories, I didn't realize that then. I know this now. I was really using a different part of my brain, so that I could listen with my inner ear, not these ears right then. Now we know with what's happening with neuroscience what was going on, but I'll get into that in a little bit. But first I want to share a metaphor that I've used over the last 20-some years, and I've gotten feedback from people all over the world, individuals and therapists, that have told me this was transformative for them. And so as a result, that became my favorite, right? It's like if it's transformative for others, then that's what I want to do. And I remember the day that I was sitting in my office and I had a client, and I was trying to, first of all, instill hope for recovery, and I was trying to explain to her what the recovery process was going to look like, and also introduce the idea that there was an adaptive function to what it was that she was doing with eating and food. So here we go. Imagine Imagine you're on the banks of a raging river. It's pouring down rain. You slip and you fall in and you're drowning. You're getting pulled down through the rapids. And along comes a big log and you grab on. And the log saves your life. It keeps your head above water when surely you would have drowned. And eventually it carries you to a place in the river where the water is calm. And from there you can see the riverbank, but you can't get there because of the log. So the irony is that the very thing that just saved your life is now getting in the way of you going where you want to go in life. So then I might say, okay, the log is your eating disorder. And it's important to understand that there was a time it may have saved your life and helped you keep from drowning in some very strong, emotionally turbulent times. And it served a function, and a very important function, and it would behoove you to find out what that function is. Because now it's getting in the way of you getting where you want to go in life. Now, but it's way more complicated than that, because there's always people on the riverbank yelling, let go of the log, let go of the log, right? And you feel like an absolute idiot because you can't let go of that log, especially since those people might be the top eating disorder expert in the country, or the people who love you more than life itself. So the way I see it is letting go of that log may not be the very best thing to do initially. Is what happens if you let go of that log, start to swim to shore, get halfway there, and realize, oh shoot, I don't have the strength, confidence to make it. Now you're really sunk, because that means you don't have the strength to make it back to the log either. And I believe that there's a wise part of ourselves that will not let us let go of anything until we're good and ready. So what do you do instead? Well, let go of the log, try floating. When you start to sink, grab back on. Let go of the log, practice treading water. When you get tired, grab back on. Let go of the log, swim around it once, grab back on. Twice, grab back on. 10 times, 100 times, 200 times, whatever it takes for you to have the strength and confidence to let go of the log, then you let go of the log. So through this metaphor, I'm already introducing the idea that the disordered eating behaviors or thoughts have a function, a very important function, and in order to completely let go, it's important to find out what that function is. So once someone can do that, then they can learn other ways of getting the relief, or which they get only temporarily, by using eating behaviors or food restriction to cope with overwhelming feelings that get stirred up in certain situations, or with relationships, or by certain memories. So, and with this metaphor, I'm also introducing the idea that there are skills, that once somebody develops these skills, they'll no longer need to do whatever it is they've been doing with food. So how do you solve the mystery of the eating disorder and find out what this function is, right? So first of all, the first thing is you're going to have to surrender all judgment. Which is hard when they're doing things that appear to be self-destructive, right? That's really hard. But with this log metaphor, what I'm doing is I'm, as best I can, bypassing this shame and judgment around the eating disorder, that they're filled with that. They don't need my judgment. And so when you can kind of bring this idea, no wonder you're doing this, it starts to make sense. And now there's energy for healing. So with metaphor, you can start to find the function of the eating disorders that are tucked way deep, often within the psyche. But here's the coolest surprise of all. I love this. The food itself, or the food behaviors, will actually point you towards what the real problems are. This is where it gets really a lot of fun in the recovery process. And not only that, what the skills are that a person needs to stop doing whatever it is they're doing. And so I'm going to show you how that works. But first I want to talk a little bit about what metaphor is. So according to Webster's dictionary, metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or a phrase literally denoting one kind of object or idea is used in place of another to suggest a likeness or an analogy between them. So, like notice in the log metaphor, I didn't say anything about eating disorders or food, right? But I was definitely talking about the experience of having an eating disorder, the fear and desperation that can accompany sensation of drowning or feeling out of control, the temporary relief with grabbing onto something, and then the frustration that comes with not being able to let go. So basically, I'm addressing the eating disorder experience on multiple levels without pointing any fingers or doing any kind of blaming. So metaphors work on multiple levels of the psyche. There's the mental, which holds different meanings at the same time. There's the physical. It uses a different part of the brain and also works with sensations that start moving through the body. And also the emotional, where it evokes feelings like surprise or confusion or freedom or whatever. So with the log metaphor, I'm addressing the person's thoughts on the mental level, evoking the physical sensations of drowning and the emotional feelings that may accompany that by using their imagination. That's what we're doing. And so I'm accessing a different part of their brain that is able to make these connections. So the idea is that when someone is coming in, somehow this is a way to bring in a sense of hopefulness and even the idea of some relief, at least momentarily, from the shame and bringing meaning to their experience. So one of my favorite reasons, though, for working with metaphor is that metaphors can shift something that appears to be negative into something positive. And the reason why that's so important to me is that's where the energy for healing is, right? Using this log metaphor, I'm introducing this idea of adaptive function so that they can shift their perception and entertain the idea that there might be a reason, perhaps a really good reason, for whatever it is that they're doing. Again, if I just simply told them, well, you're not broken, damaged goods or whatever, I'll probably, be up against their resistance or against a lot of eating disorder thoughts. It'll be like a brick wall. But I'm not talking about eating disorders. I'm talking about a log in the river, and so it's like coming in through the back door or the window, and I'll get in any way I can, is the way I see it. So metaphors are also catalyst for change. And so a catalyst is something that changes something else without it changing. I've told that black and white story, the cattle story, lots of times. It's always the same story, but it doesn't always have the same effect depending on who I'm speaking with, where they're at in their recovery process. That's where this change occurs. So Carl Jung called metaphor the healing symbol. And he said, the power of metaphor lies in its ability to transform perception of seemingly meaningless patterns of thought and behavior into an awareness that these patterns hold and can reveal deeper truths. So it's this transforming function of that gives meaning to the struggle with the eating disorder and provides the energy that's needed for healing. So with this metaphor, I'm introducing the idea that there's meaning, often profound meaning, to their struggle, to something that previously had appeared meaningless. So when I was a young graduate student, I walked into probably one of my very first classes, and there was this little old man up in front, and he was speaking with a really thick accent, and I knew he was speaking English, but I had to really struggle to understand what he was saying. And that man was Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And those of you who don't know who he was a very famous psychiatrist who, out of his experience in the Nazi prison camp during World War II, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning and developed logotherapy. And basically what he came to understand is that you can get stripped of everything that had ever been dear to you. But there's one thing that can never be taken away from you, and that is the meaning you give to your experience, and therein lies your freedom. So, he influenced me so much that when I started getting in the field of eating disorders, it was like a heat-seeking missile, right? Where's the meaning to it? I couldn't help myself. So with metaphor, we've got this transforming function, and it's a universal feature in our poems, in our songs, in fairy tales, in our dreams, in our art, and it can be transformative in the treatment setting as well. So what Jung said is that metaphors affect the person on 3 levels. There's the mental, where we interpret the meaning. Then there's the emotional, where we connect to the feelings embedded in the metaphor. And then there's the imaginative. And according to him, this is where the actual transforming power resides. So with the log metaphor, I'm bringing in that mental concept that there's a function and there's a reason for what they're doing. I'm stirring up feelings as they imagine what it's like to be drowning and not being able to let go, and then asking them to use their imagination. First, by picturing a situation where they're feeling helpless and stuck. That it's removed from their current situation. We're talking about a log in a river. So that then they can shift their perception and imagine what that process might be like to break free of the struggle. But of course, there's always a catch, right? As there is in always good stories, because what happens when they can't get where they want to go? And so here they get to relate to the irony of being stuck. When that wasn't their initial intention, when they went on that diet or whatever came up for them, where they thought, okay, for this, I'm going to lose weight and then I'll be happy and everything's fine, I'll get the job and I'll get the guy or whatever they want. So only then do I introduce this concept that's usually pretty novel for them, that there might be a very wise part of themselves that will not let them let go of anything until they're good and ready. So in doing all of this, they're picturing recovery. So through their imagination, they can grasp the idea that, this can take a while. There's skills they got to develop, but they don't need some special DNA, right? They don't need to have a particular talent. They're skills that anyone can learn. And so here comes the hope. But here's also what Jung said. He said, simultaneous operation on these 3 levels, the mental, the emotional, and the imaginative, enables metaphor to make a deep connection to the psyche, and because of this, change can be more immediate. Isn't that what we all want as practitioners, right? Sometimes we don't have a whole lot of time to work with our clients, whether for financial reasons, or insurance, or maybe because our clients are easily frustrated and they're just going to give up. So I want to show you give you an idea of how this works. So, okay, all right. So look at these right angles. Can you see these right angles? All right. So now if I say to you, capital letter E, what happens? That's how fast it is, right? Got it. Now you can't even see the right angles, right? All you can see is the capital letter E. So Rudolf Steiner, who is, he created Waldorf schools, Steiner schools, I call it, in Europe. He was a scientist and educator and philosopher. He says the intellectual powers of rational thought, judgment, and critical thinking need to be rooted in the ground of feeling and imagination. Without imagery, which are the living pictures seen in the eye of the mind, intellectual concepts cannot be fully grasped. Well, I don't have PowerPoint. Years ago when I first started on the lecture circuit, and PowerPoint had just come out, I got so excited because I had all these great idea for all these images. And I have an inner guidance system that I communicate with, and I went, no, Anita, you're not doing PowerPoint. And I argue with my inner guidance system. I say, oh, no, I can get it. I can learn that technology. Because I could see what people were doing. They lose their train of thought. They just push the button and now they're on track. I thought, oh, this would be great. But no, my guidance system says, no, your job is to help people create the living pictures in the eye of their mind. You can't be delivering it up. And I learned this because my children went to Waldorf schools. And when they were little, they started with preschool and kindergarten, and there were 3 rules. No violence, okay? No picture shirts, excuse me, and no Disney talk. And I thought, is this a cult? So that's when I started reading Steiner, because I wanted to know what this was about. I mean, we had fights in the morning. Oh, Mommy is my favorite rose t-shirt. It's like, sorry, it's got a rose on it. Because what Steiner understood was this, is when the children were young and their brains and their minds are developing, they are very vulnerable to images that are delivered up, and it interferes with them developing not just their capacity for imagination, but their empathy, right? Because you have to imagine what it's like when that person stubs their toe in order for you to have empathy for that. So those were the rules, and I was like, okay, I got it. No Disney talk? I mean, Disney wasn't even around when Steiner was on the planet, right? But the idea behind that is, if I were to say to you, Snow White, already you guys know what she looks like, right? That black hair parted down the middle, those two little bun-like things. And you women, you know the dress, the puffy sleeves, the yellow and blue. And if I say to you, Alice in Wonderland, long wavy blonde hair, she's wearing that pinafore over a blue dress. Disney has robbed you of your own Snow White. So the idea that Marion Woodman says, Jungian analyst, who recently passed away from Toronto, she says eating disorders are a failure of the imagination. So a lot of working with metaphor and storytelling is helping cultivate that capacity. They say if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a metaphor is worth 1,000 pictures. So now, recently though, neuroscience has developed the technology that gives us a glimpse into the brain functioning that allows us now to see how these processes work. So for the longest time, I called it seeing the lights going on in someone's eyes, because when I was working with metaphor, it was kind of like throwing spaghetti at the wall. Whatever's going to stick, but I could see when it happened, something would be like a spark behind their eyes. Now neuroscience can tell us something about what's actually going on in the brain when that occurs. So it wasn't really too long ago, the 1980s. So, that was right when I was started working with eating disorders. Back then, the right hemisphere of the brain was considered the minor hemisphere, really, and believed to have little to do with language and generally lacking in higher cognitive functioning. In the 1990s, scientists noticed that patients with right hemisphere damage had serious cognitive problems. They couldn't understand jokes, sarcasm, and metaphor. So they discovered that the purpose of the right hemisphere was to find these subtle connections between seemingly unrelated things. And so that its primary function was to make sense of the world as a whole, and not to see just all the parts. So the left hemisphere helps us see the trees, the right hemisphere helps us see the forest. It helps us connect the dots. Now, think about how many individuals struggling with eating disorders perceive their struggle with eating as totally unrelated, totally disconnected to what's going on in the rest of their lives, because they can't see that connection between what they're doing with food and what's going on with their thoughts, and what's going on with them and their food, and what's happening with their feelings, and what's going on with them and their eating, and what's happening in relationships. They are two separate things for them. So often when someone comes to Pono, the kinds of things we hear are, everything is fine, I just have this problem with my weight. Or, I don't have an eating disorder, I just don't like to eat when I'm stressed. What do you think an eating disorder is? What happened in the past is over. It has nothing to do with my eating difficulties. My marriage or my finances aren't that great, but that's not why I have an eating disorder. There's nothing wrong with my life. My parents are just overreacting to my weight loss. My food restriction or my binging or my purging has nothing to do with my emotions. I feel fine. My life is great. I don't know why I have an eating disorder. Or I just like food too much. Or I don't have enough willpower. So ultimately, they believe that there's no meaning behind what they're doing with food because they can't perceive it. So they fill in the blank, unfortunately, with their worst insecurity, which is, there must be something wrong with me, fundamentally wrong with me. So what the scientists now are discovering is that the left hemisphere of the brain tends to be sequential. The right hemisphere is simultaneous. So remember what Jung said about metaphor affecting the different levels in the psyche simultaneously. So we've got the left hemisphere analyzing details and right hemisphere synthesizing the bigger picture. We got the left hemisphere handling denotation, which is the literal meaning of words. It specializes in text, right? The right hemisphere, it handles connotation, all the meanings that you can't look up in a dictionary. So punchlines, for example, are going to rely on right hemisphere activity to uncover linguistic associations, and then it's funny when that happens, because it specializes in context. So Joseph Campbell, writer and lecturer on comparative mythology, comparative religion, he cautioned against reading metaphors found in religion in terms of denotation instead of the connotation, and taking religious symbolism too literally. I would caution you about taking eating disorder symptomology too literally. Be very careful about disparaging comments about the body and negative body talk, or taking it as face value as though that's really what they're talking about, and not something way more profound. So when Romeo says, Juliet is the sun, we know he's not saying that she's a massive flaming ball of hydrogen, but rather he's calling attention to aspects of Juliet that might also apply to the sun. She lights up his life. So now your left hemisphere is not going to be helpful here, right? Because if it focuses on literal definitions of words, if you made a list of all the things that the sun and Juliet had in common, you're not going to figure out what Romeo's talking about. But the right hemisphere is able to zoom out and find the overlapping associations, those nuanced qualities. So the sun is a metaphor. It's not a simile, because I didn't use the word like. And it takes two concepts that are superimposed one upon the other. Juliet is the sun. Romeo's not saying she's like the sun. So something different happens in the brain. So with the simile, it too, and simile, analogy, like metaphor, they're very powerful tools. But an analogy is a logical argument that shows how two different things are similar in one way. Similes use the word like. So an example of and all of these can be really effective with eating disorders. An example of a simile that I would use is that eating disorders are like a weed. If you just cut it off at the top, given the right circumstances, it's going to come right back. But if you go down and you clear those roots, then you can totally eradicate it, and it's a done deal. So what happens with metaphors, they are implicit and analogies are explicit. With an analogy, you kind of spell it out. A metaphor is literally false. An analogy is literally true. But metaphors need a bit more imagination to interpret, whereas analogies are more readily apparent. We know Juliet is not literally the sun. We're required to use our imagination to get a sense of the connection that Shakespeare was referencing. But with just 4 words, we get a pretty good idea about how Romeo feels about Juliet. So with the log story, I'm using both metaphoric language and analogy. So I'll start out using metaphor, and then I'll kind of spell it out. I don't leave them hanging there like, oh, what are you talking about? It's like, okay, I might walk them through that. So what we're trying to do with eating disorder treatment is help the patients navigate this paradox. It's about food, it's not about food, and stop looking at what they're doing with food so literally. So through metaphor, we can help them expand their focus beyond counting calories so that they can see what they're doing with food is related to what's going on in their psyche. How they're obsessively watching the number on the scale is related to their feelings. How their eating disorder is a reflection of what's going on in the rest of their life. How fear of fat and negative body image thoughts are actually an expression of deeper fears that they don't know how to respond to. So, from the perspective of the brain, a metaphor is a bridge between two ideas that, at least on the surface, are not equivalent or related. So, here's where the fun begins, I think. Scientists have discovered now these rigorous ways of using a combination of EEGs, electrical waves produced by the brain, and fMRIs, which gives you your map, to study insight and metaphor by identifying the aspects of the brain that are better able to see these hidden connections and the remote associations between separate ideas. So, the most recent discoveries the function of the right hemisphere shows that that part of the brain is instrumental in transforming mental blocks into breakthroughs. Don't we want that, right? And in fighting the subtle connection between seemingly unrelated things. So for this reason, I believe that it's the right hemisphere that brings about the insight that can create the breakthroughs that we desperately want in the treatment of eating disorders. So according to these studies, what's going on is a steady stream of alpha brainwave activity from the right hemisphere allows for insight to occur most easily. Those of you folks that are into mindfulness, this is why. And then there's a spike in gamma wave activity in the anterior superior temporal gyrus, and it occurs immediately before the insight, 30 milliseconds. So there's a researcher named Mark Jung, interestingly enough, Jung Beeman, and I'm going to give you an example of some of, how's our time? Oh, we got time. So what some of these studies were like, because it's really pretty clever. So I'm going to let you, so imagine you're all hooked up, right? They're looking at your brain, they're going to see what's going to happen here. Now these are some of the tests you're given. Rearrange the letters, you ready for this? N-E-W-D-O-O-R into one word. If you get the answer, raise your hand. Don't say it out loud. So the letters N-E-W-D-O-O-R. Rearrange them into one word. And if I had music, it would go do, 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 do. So don't say it. Just raise your hand if you get it. She got it. This woman works with Sandplace, so she lives on the right side of her brain. The answer is one word. How terrible is that? Can you imagine being a subject in these studies? You're going to start feeling really stupid. Here's another one. Here's another kind of idea. So here's some puzzles that they would give. And that they're looking to see if you're solving this puzzle with analysis or insight, and they're trying to see what's going on in the brain. So I want you to pick a word. I'm going to give you 3 words, and you pick a word that can form a compound word or phrase. All right? So, age, mile, and sand. So I want you to find a word that can be a compound word or phrase with either with all 3 of age, mile, and sand. I'm not going to make you guys suffer. If you get the answer, you can raise your hand. She got it. 2 people got it. Okay. Left-handed folks have an edge up, right? We're on that other side. We're always in our right brain. Can't help ourselves. So the word is stone. Stone age, milestone, sandstone. Okay, now you see how this works, right? I'm going to give you another one. Here we go. Pine, crab, sauce. What's a word that will create a compound word or phrase with pine, crab, sauce? Raise your hand if you get it. I will not make you suffer. I will tell you the answer is apple, pineapple, crab apple, applesauce. Dreadful, huh? So you can imagine, I mean, I could go on and on, but I'm not, because I want to just give you an idea of the experience of how they came to this understanding. So basically what they observed is, first we got the activity in your left brain, it's looking all over, trying to find the answers. But this, I didn't give you much time, but if you were in the normal research setting, this would have been really tiring. And you would have been frustrated, and negative feelings would have come up. And what they discovered is that the negative feelings are important, because that's what signals the brain to shift activity to the other side, to explore the unexpected set of associations. So the struggle forces us to try something new. Then 30 milliseconds, for you 3 that got it, 30 milliseconds before the answer erupted into your consciousness, there's a spike of gamma wave rhythm. It's the highest electrical frequency in the brain, and it's believed to come from the binding of the neuron cells that are distributed right here. And this is where your anterior superior temporal gyrus is. It's right above your right ear in a little fold in the cortex, and it kind of looks like California. It's kind of like that shape. So what they're finding is this is the neural correlate of insight. So it's this little tiny small tissue, and it becomes unusually active just before insight, but totally silent when a subject uses analysis. So the activation is sudden, happens like that. It's intense, and there's a surge of electricity leading to a rush of blood. And other studies have linked this part of the brain to the interpretation of metaphors and comprehension of jokes. So when you're laughing at a joke, you're firing here. But it's this activity that allows the brain to make a set of distant and original connections. So really you're creating new neural pathways, and I love to share this with the patients because at Pono I tell them, okay, when we're doing this work, when you leave here, you're taking your brain with you, right? And we're creating new neural pathways that are going to go with you when you leave. So the brain is literally, it's changing. And they like to hear that because they feel hopeless, helpless, right? And we say, no. New neural pathways are going to be created till the day you die. Let's get started. So this kind of insight is freeing and it's enlightening, both in terms of illumination and levity. So things lighten up. These folks it's heavy, despair, this is hard work, recovering and struggling with an eating disorder. So anytime you can bring illumination or levity, in my mind, that's a good thing. So how do we put this into practice? I'm going to give you a particular technique I've used forever, a metaphor. So we begin with imagination, right? Imagine you have two tanks. Tank A, tank B. Tank A is the tank you fill when you need physical nourishment. You fill it with food. Tank B is the tank you fill when you need emotional or spiritual nourishment. You fill it with things like attention, affection, appreciation, meditation, prayer, and so on. But what happens is most of us aren't told that. And so we get it all mixed up and we think there's just one tank. So before we know it, tank A is full and overflowing. We're still hungry. Or we don't want to get close to tank A because it's like the bottomless pit. It never ends. So what has to happen is you have to learn how to tease the two tanks apart. And here's where the skill set starts to come in. Because what a person has to learn is interoceptive and proprioceptive awareness. They have to find their hunger and satiety skills. Now, certainly at the residential level of care, they have to be on a food plan to stabilize. But they're not going to be on a food plan the whole of their lives, right? That's where you begin. That's not where you end. Ultimately, they're headed towards intuitive eating, where they're responding to internal cues for their appetite. So I'm not going to get a whole lot into how you do that, but basically it's a matter of teaching them how to read and respond to their physical sensations. It's a contraction and an expansion, a heaviness, a lightness, a roughness, a smoothness, a hollowness, a density. I feel like pizza is not a physical sensation. So sorting that out and really learning. So I'm not going to get into that often. It's really helpful to have a dietitian, someone who's well-versed in intuitive eating, health at every size, that really understands those concepts. But that is part of this process. You got to untangle these two tanks apart. And so I'm going to just say, just for the sake of argument, that let's say you're struggling with this, and this is the kind of thing that we will hear when someone is trying to tune in to these signals. And I have an online course, the Light of the Moon Cafe, where we teach this, and we have a forum, and I respond to everybody on the forum. But here, to give you an idea of what happens when someone's getting a hang of it, I'm going to read you some of their comments. I usually couldn't identify hunger until I felt clammy, shaky, and lightheaded. Now I'm starting to notice it when thoughts of food pop up in non-food related tasks. If I try to wait until I think I should be hungry by checking the time instead of my hunger cues, then that feeling turns to general irritability and frustration. So they're sorting it down. Someone else says, my hunger is a sense of contracting and opening below my ribs, because I try to get them specific in their bodies. Where is it? Empty, gnawing feeling, often with a tightening at the base of my throat. Someone else would say, my physical hunger signal is a burning sensation in my stomach area. The best way I know how to describe my fullness signal is like the deep thunk sound when a heavy rock is dropped in water like a lake or a pond. So you can see they can't help themselves. They're talking about physical sensations, but they're using metaphor. So part of teasing these two tanks apart requires looking at the eating behaviors that occur during those times that the client is aware that there are no physical cues present and they're wanting to eat, or there is a physical hunger signal and they're not letting themselves eat. So for the sake of imagination, imagine that, and they figured it all out. They got it, they nailed it, they know their hunger and satiety cues. And so reaching for the pizza, check in, not a hunger signal in sight. Well, guess what? That's when you've tumbled down Alice in Wonderland's rabbit hole, landed smack dab in tank B. And in tank B, pizza's not pizza. Food is not food. What is it? It's a concrete physical symbol of another kind of hunger that's being experienced that you probably don't even know about. This is where the fun begins. So this idea that, there's all these other hungers, but they're coded. And in order to find those hungers, you have to crack the code. And I love this because the code is in the food itself. So often I'll say, okay, so the first question you ask yourself when you realize you've teased the two tanks apart is, what is the feeling I'm trying not to feel? So we don't eat for emotional reasons, because we don't want to feel those emotions, those messy, scary, overwhelming, whatever emotions. So what's the feeling I'm trying not to feel? And typically, I'm here to tell you, the answer is going to be, I feel fine, everything's okay, because it's unconscious. And Jung said the unconscious really is unconscious, right? It's out of your awareness. So how do you crack the code? And here's just a basic outline how to start to do this. Now, we're all different, so, we're all unique, but you have to start somewhere. So it goes something like this. Sweet foods usually have to feel with feelings of there not being enough sweetness in your life, or feeling like you're not sweet enough. Crunchy, salty foods typically are connected with unexpressed anger and frustration. Warm foods, soups and stews, are often connected for a craving for emotional warmth. Spicy foods for a craving or fear of excitement, stimulation, and change. And chocolate, sex and romance, right? Valentine's Day, we know this one. So now remember, these categories only apply when they are out of alignment with physical sensations of hunger and satiety. So, and it works in either direction. Either you're afraid of it or you crave it. If anyone's interested in this, you can go to lightofthemooncafe.com and you can download it. There on the homepage, there's a PDF. You can get it that spells this all out, so you don't have to write it all down. I'm going to give you some examples of what this looks like. How's our time? Okay. So I had a client, and she was struggling with bulimia nervosa, and I asked her if there were a food that she wished she could eat and there'd be no consequences, right? No consequences whatsoever. What would that food be? And she said, it'd be vanilla ice cream with strawberries on top. And I said, okay, I want you to imagine I've never had vanilla ice cream with strawberries on top, and you're going to tell me what's so fabulous about it. She said, well, it's sweet, it's smooth, and it's refreshing. Well, when we took a look at what was going on in her life, her boyfriend was accusing her of not being sweet enough. She'd hit a really rough patch with her parents that she was desperately wanting to smooth out, and she was in a dead-end job in need of a refreshing change. One food, 6 months of therapy. Oftentimes it's in the language. You learn to listen metaphorically. So another client I had, she was an emergency room physician struggling with binge eating disorder. And she came into my office once just beating herself up. She was so upset. And I said, wow, what's going on? She's like, I can't believe I did this. It's so horrible. I said, whoa, what happened? She goes, well, I came off my shift, came home, fixed some chicken tenders for dinner for my husband and myself. And when he got home, before he even got home, I ate them all myself. I can't even believe I did it. I'm so disgusted. I went, whoa, let's roll black. Let's see what happened. So I said, so what happened? You just got off a 12, 14-hour shift in the ER? She said, yeah. And I said, so what do you think you were really hungry for? Because we had worked together for a while. And she said, a hug. I said, yeah, you needed some TLC, some tender, loving care, and instead you ate the chicken tenders. Now, because this was on target, the lights went off in her eyes, and she got it. Now, this woman will never eat chicken tenders again if she's not physically hungry, because she got that connection for herself. It really gets to be a lot of fun with this when you're working with it. At Pono, we had a young woman. She was absolutely refusing to eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And so when I asked her to describe her aversion, she said she hated the super sweetness of the jelly and the stickiness of the peanut butter and how they were just smashed together between the bread. And she was astonished when she heard herself say this, because we were doing the metaphor work, that she was describing her experience of being caught up in the conflict between her cloyingly sweet mother and her overprotective father's stickiness. And she got it. She got that there is something here. So I want to read you some examples of some of the amazing insights that have come up with these kinds of connections through storytelling and metaphor exercises. So here's from someone with binge eating disorder. I crave heavy, oily foods often, things that will sustain me and give me a sense of lasting nourishment. I feel that this is revealing my general sense of being tired with inadequate energy and vigor for everything that needs my attention. So she is like tracking it. Here's another one. There's something about chocolate that I'd call depth. It's as if I was craving more depth in my relationship, but also in my overall approach to life. I seem to satisfy myself with superfluous understanding, enjoyment, and connection. Now, in the same way that chocolate develops a multitude of flavors in each bite and melts, I'd like to seize that aspect in my life as well. Allow each moment to flourish and explore all the flavors it has to give, and maybe give depth to my own expression, my own personality as it expresses itself in the world. See how profound this gets? I mean, it's awesome. Here's someone with anorexia nervosa. The true nature of the emotional and or physical hunger is my need for love of some sort. But accompanying that need is a great deal of pain. Having far too little food eases the pain at that moment and helps assuage the pain if the need for love is unanswered. Whoa, right? It's so insightful. Someone with bulimia nervosa says, I crave soda, popcorn, cookies, and fast food. The interesting thing I found is that all of these represent times in my childhood that I felt loved and in a group. Anytime I'm alone, I want to turn to these foods. I need to find another way to soothe those feelings other than eating, not to mention eating doesn't really help. And sometimes I say, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you, when we do this metaphor work, that food's going to stop working for you in that way. So it's a good thing we're developing the skills along the way. So I hope you can see how exciting it is for me to work with metaphor, because very quickly it can take somebody to a level of depth and understanding. And these are their words. I'm not putting words in. I'm not having them follow a recipe or a formula. So what happens when looking at eating disorders metaphorically is that the bigger picture, the rest of the story gets revealed, which is why for me, trying to get rid of the symptoms immediately isn't the best thing. Now, of course, in residential, that is a place where they get some reprieve from acting on it, but trust me, those thoughts, they're wild and furious. And so it's like understanding that there's meaning there, and you don't want to take that away. You want to really explore it. So after all these years, it's been clear to me there's really no such thing as an eating disorder. Now, I know this kind of sounds a little blasphemous, since that's been my work, and I understand there are severe, life-threatening consequences for food restriction or binging and purging, but there's so much more going on than the struggle with food and eating. So what's going on with someone is really indicative of a larger pattern that can be destructive in other areas of their life. And the good news is that when you start to work with that pattern in the eating behaviors, it affects affects those other areas as well. And it works both ways. When you work with those other areas in their life, it affects the eating. So it's this whole interconnected idea. So for example, for someone that's restricting food, there's other things they're restricting in their lives. Emotional expression, new experiences, intimate relationships, their sexuality. They're always putting themselves on restriction when they make a mistake. More often than not, the desire to restrict comes from feeling that life itself is too much. And you can see if someone's had trauma, it's like, oh, well, no wonder. No wonder you want to restrict your experience of life. It's like too much, and you don't have the skill set for dealing with it. Or they feel like they are too much. Their emotions are too much. Their desires, their hungers are too much, and they don't know how to handle that. So the metaphor of restriction, whatever feels like too much, it shows up everywhere. And if you start to attune to that, so much information comes forth. In many areas, those that are caught up in the binge purge cycle, typically, that you'll see this also in yo-yo dieting, you're going to see a tendency to take in too much, get overwhelmed, and then, got to do something to get rid of it. So that what you're going to find is they might fall head over heels in love 1 minute, and then as soon as there's a problem, I got to get out of this relationship. Or they might sign up for a whole load of classes and then get overwhelmed and drop out. Or they may take on too many projects and then just drop everything. So you'll see this binge purge pattern of taking in too much more quickly than they can assimilate, and then just got to bail. And so when you've got somebody who's struggling with binge eating, you're going to find the theme of scarcity everywhere. It's not just that there's not enough food, there's not enough money, there's not enough time, there's not enough love, there's not enough attention, or they're not enough. And so this not enough thing and that feeling of scarcity is going to come up everywhere. And so you can start to connect that with that theme to what's going on. So just to end, and we're almost at the time, using the language of metaphor, we can help our clients shift their perception, find meaning in the struggle, find those subtle connections between what's going on with them and food and what's happening in the rest of their lives. And through metaphor, they can start to see how disordered eating behaviors are a way of communicating something that they, for one reason or another, have not been able to put into words. That food can be a symbol for emotional nourishment, and for many of them, that's a really novel concept. Eating disorder thoughts can be a way of responding to non-physical hungers. Food restriction can represent a need to limit intense emotion or experiences or relationships. Binging can be an attempt to stuff or escape from uncomfortable emotions or to fulfill what is missing in their lives. Purging can be due to difficulties integrating or assimilating feelings or experiences that have been overwhelming. So what happens is they learn a new language. They learn the language of symbolism and metaphor, and they bring another part of their brain on board, create new neural pathways, change their minds and their brains and their bodies. So, questions. 2 minutes of questions. No, I have 3 minutes of questions. Questions, anyone?
Questions.
Yes.
What question was it that you asked for the metaphor with their food item? Was it just kind of general, or for the metaphor that you read?
Right. So can you
Did you ask them a specific question, like what might, like what food might, you want to write a metaphor about? Like how did they come up with it?
Oh, okay. So typically they know the foods, right? They know the foods they hate or they're scared of. And so I might say something like, come up with a food that you really struggle with. Either you can't eat that food, or if you start eating, you can't stop, or even oftentimes I'll say, so if someone comes in and they say, oh my God, I just binged and purged the whole peach pie. I go, good. No, good, because now it's right here in the room with us. With that pie, we will then start to just decode that right then and there.
Like what is pie to you?
So I would say no. I said, I want you to hook me on peach pie. I want you, at the end of this session, I'm going to go get myself a peach pie. Tell me what's fabulous about it. And they'll go, I don't like it because it's so fattening. Or no, we don't talk. I'll stop them on that. I don't want to hear about calories, fat, none of that. No, I want to know what is fabulous about peach pie. And they'll say, well, it's really sweet, but then there's this crunchy, crisp edge around the inside. But when you bite in, it's really soft. So I'm listening. I'm listening for where the energy is in their words. And so if I hear the sweet, okay, I'm already thinking, okay, where are they missing sweetness in their life? They're not thinking they're sweet enough. And then the crunchy around the edge, might be some frustration about boundaries, right? And it's cluing me in boundaries. But then soft inside. So how do you have sweetness? And then I'll be thinking, because I already know something about them, their relationship with her husband. Maybe she's feeling like she's not getting much sweetness there, but in order to do so, she's afraid to create boundaries because then she won't get that soft, warm feeling inside. So that's kind of what my mind starts doing, and I'll question, though. I don't know. This is what's going on with her, and so then I'll start to ask. So, could it be this? Could it be this? Could it be this? And I wait until something clicks. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other pressing questions? It's the end of the day. We all want to go. You probably want to go eat something now. Yeah. Yeah.
No longer in the DSM?
Is it in the DSM? Mm-mm. But I think it gets a little tricky because, overeating, that constant grazing, as far as I'm concerned, that's an eating disorder, right? And so I look at that like that constant grazing. So what is the constant thing that's kind of in the back of your mind that's just kind of and I'm looking at scarcity. That's how I'd work with it. It's like where is there this constant, ongoing, never leaves you alone experience of I can't get what I want in life, and I and it's not this, but it's not this, it's not this, it's not that. So thank you for joining us. And there's information if you haven't gotten any of that.